Tate loved fast cars, and he loved motor racing. It wasn't long before he began to add to his enjoyment of the sport by keeping a record on film. First using a humble 8mm camera, and then graduating to 16mm. Tate was born in 1923 into the family which controlled Britain's premier sugar refining business, Tate & Lyon, and which, through its patronage of the arts, had given the nation the Tate Gallery. In World War II, Tate flew Spitfires in the RAF, and it was there that a friendship was born with fellow pilot Mike Oliver. With peace restored, Oliver and another former RAF pilot, Rodney Clark, a qualified automotive engineer, joined forces with Kenneth McAlpine of the civil engineering and construction family to found a sports car company, later to be called Connaught. So it was through his friendship with Oliver that Tate became so close to motor racing. For the next 20 years or so, he lived through and recorded the greatest period of change that British motorsport was ever to pass through. A period which saw motor racing in Britain change from a purely amateur pastime for rich playboys to a huge, high-tech industry in which Britain now leads the world. A period which saw the emergence of Britain's first true factory teams, Jaguar, Aston Martin and others. The re-emergence and swift departure of the might of Germany in the shape of the Mercedes motor racing machine was an interlude which allowed Stirling Moss to become the first Briton to win the British Grand Prix. The period saw the development of British racing teams able to take on and beat the legendary Italian marques of Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, Maserati and Lancia. The trend was started by BRM, but they were impossibly overambitious with their B16 back in the early 50s. The next on the scene were Vanwall, and starting with the British Grand Prix in 1957, they won a total of 9 Grand Prix before the rear engine revolution overtook them. This revolution was led by Cooper, and they were followed by Lotus, BRM and Brabham. Tate filmed through all of this, attached first to the Connaught team and then to Aston Martin, who capped years of setback and frustration by winning the World Sports Car Championship 1959. In Grand Prix racing, Tate filmed alongside the man who, perhaps more than any other, epitomizes those years of change. The first private entrant to win a World Championship Grand Prix, a man to give both Cooper and Lotus their first Grand Prix victories, the man behind many of Stirling Moss's greatest victories, the man in question, Rob Walker. And Tate was still rolling his camera in the 70s, by which time Grand Prix racing had become the professional, highly sponsored sport it is today. Tate died in 1989, aged only 66. This, then, is his entirely personal record of motor racing. His diary was read by his son Christopher.
So it was time to say farewell to Celia and point the Aston in the direction of the Channel and Le Mans. The maps were new, but this wasn't the first time we'd been to the south. That first visit was 2 years ago in 1951, for what was in fact only the third post-war race, which had seen the debut of the C-Type Jaguar. And whilst not belittling the pre-war efforts of the famous Bentley boys, the C-Type represented Britain's first serious professional challenge. In 1951, Stirling Moss had led for Jaguar before dropping out with failing oil pressure, and the same fate later befell the Leslie Johnson C-Type. Nevertheless, the two Peters, Messrs. Whitehead and Walker, had survived the onslaught of the Ferraris, the Cunninghams and the Talbots to give Jaguar a famous victory. In 1953, we were staying at Mamere, 40 kilometres north of Le Mans, checking into the Hotel d'Espagne, and driving to Le Mans itself for coffee the next morning. There was time to watch the citizens of Le Mans go about their daily business, and to ponder over last year's race. Jaguar had not been able to repeat their 1951 victory. They had been totally eclipsed for speed by the new Mercedes 300 SL, complete with those futuristic gull-wing doors. Alberto Ascari in a Ferrari had set the lap record before retiring, leaving Mercedes with a 1-2 victory. Leslie Johnson and Tommy Wisdom finished third in the Anglo-American Nash Healey. Aston's, having finished third in 1951, failed to get a single car to the finish. Out to the track around lunchtime, the first practice session having been the previous evening, and so the cars were tucked away in their garages, and the empty stands stood silently waiting for the thousands who would fill them in 2 days' time. No cars, but at least the painted nameplates above the pits whetted our appetites. Talbot, winners in 1950, Lancia, who've just won the Mille Miglia with their Jano-designed D20, the French Gordinis, Pegaso from Spain, Borgward, and also Porsche from Germany, Renault with their tiny 750 saloons, and from America, Briggs Cunningham. Fraser Nash are here, Allards also, and Alfa Romeo for the first time since before the war. Nash Healey hoping to repeat last year's successful third place. Austin Healey, Ferrari have 4 cars entered, and Bristol with a couple of curious coupés. The Jaguar C-Type is fitted with disc brakes for the first time. There's a single Oscar from Italy, and the new DB3S from Feltham. We were lunching at the Hippodrome. The best way to get there is to drive around the circuit. You could see the pit lane exit marked on the road as we cruised under the Dunlop Bridge. Down to the famous S's, and we see a Gordini getting in some unofficial practice. Tertre Rouge and the sandbanks are already in place. And there the famous line of poplar trees on the left, with not a single straw bale in sight. Then it's down the Mulsanne Straight, all 5 miles of it, the main Route Nationale to Tours. Halfway down, we stop for lunch at the Hippodrome restaurant. But lunch itself had to wait, as we weighed up the latest from the Fraser Nash factory. This is a Targa Florio model with a hard top. Production versions of this experimental car will be called Le Mans Coupés. The car is down to be driven by Wharton and Mitchell. After a satisfying lunch featuring the local speciality, Rillette de Mont, we carried on down the rest of the Mulsanne Straight, and a French racing blue Panhard with its extended tail sweeps by. And so to Mulsanne Corner. I wondered how many cars would go off into the sandbanks and lose precious minutes digging out. Then it was foot down again for the run back up to Indianapolis. Indianapolis is fast, taken in third at about 75 miles an hour. Then there's a short straight to the right-hander at Arnage. We stopped to watch for a while and rewarded with the sight of a little Gordini going through its paces. Back in the Aston, we were soon up to White House, Maison Blanche, where 3 Bentleys and other cars had their famous pile-up in 1927. Even 26 years on, there is nothing to stop one emulating Callingham and hitting the ditch and rolling into the adjoining fields. Race morning, and the car parks were already full. We'd had 2 peaceful days away down on the Loire, marvelling at the chateaux of Chenonceau and Amboise, high on the cliff above the river. After dinner on the Friday night, we'd watched final practice, and unfortunately the Spanish Pegaso had crashed and was too badly damaged to race. The starting order in the race is governed by engine capacity, and we found it nearly a quarter of a mile walk from the 750 Renaults up to the 5.5-litre Cunninghams at the head of the field. Ranked 4 and 5 came the Allard J2Rs. The Disco Volante, or Flying Saucer, is the new model from Alfa Romeo, with a lot expected of it. Mike Hawthorne was amongst the 8 Ferrari drivers, a list that included Alberto Ascari and Luigi Villoresi. We saw Jaguar's founder, William Lyons, on the pit counter, eager to see his C-Types win again, and with no entry from Mercedes this year, it had to be on the cards. No doubt the product of wind tunnel testing at their Filton aeroplane base, the Bristol coupes looked very odd, with all the drivers togged up and ready to go. As the clock approaches the magic hour, a silence descends on Le Mans, only to be broken by 60 high-compression engines bursting into life and filling the place with a cacophony which will continue unbroken for 24 long hours. The Walters Fitch Cunningham got away first, leaving poor Briggs, who had so kindly come to my rescue and lent me some film of the early stages of the race, stranded. At the end of the first lap, Sidney Allard led, but not for long. He was soon overpowered by the Jaguars and Ferraris, and in fact retired on the third lap with no oil pressure. With the race well underway, it was time to stock up on the Friteries and the bar, which was not to be ignored. After 3 hours, Tony Rolt led in the number 18 Jaguar. Moss had pitted with fuel feed problems, and Hawthorne's Ferrari was disqualified for topping up with brake fluid too early on. We watched the number 7 Talbot climb the hill from the Dunlop Bridge. A yellow C-type was entered by the Belgian Jaguar distributor for Laurent and de Tournecourt. Johnny Fitch and Phil Walters drove the number 2 Cunningham, which was the fastest car in the field. Most of the huge crowd at Le Mans make a weekend of it. Not for them the comfort of our room at the Hotel d'Espagne. They rough it under canvas among the pine trees. The 6 hours of darkness are very special at Le Mans. The crowd thins to a few hardy souls, but the noise goes on as the cars rocket up the hill between the pits and the grandstands. By now, Rolt and his partner Duncan Hamilton have built a 2-lap lead over the Ferrari of Ascari and Villoresi. Just after dawn on Sunday came tragedy. Tom Cole, the American, was tragically killed when his Ferrari crashed at White House Corner. At 5 in the morning, with 11 hours still to go, only Jaguar and Cunningham could claim to have all their cars still running. And there was no sign yet of the crowd refilling the stands. This part of France is notorious for its early mist on summer mornings, and until it's burnt away by the sun's heat, this makes driving down the Mulsanne at 150 miles an hour hazardous, to say the least. Briggs Cunningham was still running strongly in the car he was sharing with the bespectacled Bill Spear. The mist hung around for a long time, and yet the morning chill and the noise of passing race cars was not enough to waken some. We watched the leading C-Type make an early morning pit stop. The car was running faultlessly, and the burly Hamilton took over from Tony Rolt for the next spell. The next arrival was the diminutive DB Panhard, a strong contender for the Index of Thermal Efficiency, a contest which measures fuel consumption against race times. The air filled with the breakfast aroma of fresh coffee, hot croissants and throat-burning gauloises to add variety to the existing odours of castrolane and burning rubber. Breakfast over, we returned to the Cunningham pit in time to see the coupe version in for a tyre change with its cut-off tail devised by the aerodynamicist Dr. Kamm. This car was driven by Charles Moran and John Bennett and was destined to finish 10th. Briggs is a multi-millionaire who just loves European-style racing. He first appeared here in 1950 with a pair of Cadillac-powered cars. Since then, winning the Le Mans 24-hour race has become an obsession with him. For this year, he'd shipped over 17 tons of equipment from the United States, and the team was being run with military precision. And when he wasn't driving the car, Briggs was in the pit, keeping an eye on the lap times. Last year, Briggs had driven for 20 of the 24 hours. Pierre Lévesque had attempted to drive the entire 1952 race by himself, but was so exhausted after 22.5 hours he had to retire as a danger to others as well as to himself. Now there's a rule that says drivers must not do more than 80 consecutive laps, or 18 hours in total. The number 2 car came in for some bodywork attention after Pitch had an altercation with the scenery. They've been chasing the third-place Jaguar of Moss and Walker. They, in turn, lay behind the Villoresi Ascari Ferrari, and Hamilton, Rolt, still leading for Jaguar. Before any car can go back into the race, the plombeur has to come along and seal the fuel filler cap with a length of tape and a lead seal. There is always a risk of disqualification if the seal is broken before a certain number of laps are completed. By lunchtime, the paddock behind the pits was starting to resemble an Italian dead car park, with red cars everywhere, Ferraris, Alfas and Lancias, with the Villoresi Ascari car now out with clutch failure. Ferrari had just one car left, that of Marzotto. Jaguars were now first and second, Cunningham third, and another Jaguar fourth. Aston's too had lost all their team, which as an Aston owner and supporter was bad news to me, coming after a similar failure in 1952. As Duncan Hamilton sped on to victory, Jaguar began to realize it could be their race. The delayed Moss car in second was backing up. By this time, just 26 of the original 60 starters remained, and Cunningham still had a full house. The only other team with all their cars running was Jaguar. The new disc brakes on the C-types had certainly paved the way for a famous victory, just reward after their disappointment last year, when the new long-tail bodywork had caused overheating, allowing Mercedes to storm to victory. As 4 o'clock approaches, the crowd started to drift away from the sideshows to congregate in the tribune area for the finish. Some could sleep through it, but still the race ran on, and we watched the Cunningham Shark chase Moss through the S's. They even hold church services at Le Mans on the Sunday morning. Is the French passion for religion or motor racing, I wonder? Back in the Cunningham pit, we waited for the number 1 car. Briggs and co-driver Spear were due in for their last stop, watched over by their team. Bill Spear handed over to Briggs for the last spell. The lap chart showed that Cunningham held 3rd, 7th and 10th places. A brilliant result when you consider that their cars were mostly brute force, and they've seen off the best that the likes of Ferrari, Aston, Alfa and Lancia can offer. I glimpsed William Lyon through the crowd. What a result for him. But there was still tension. A few more laps to go, during which anything could happen, and so often does in motor racing. Just 1 hour to go, and the atmosphere at the South changes. The cars keep circulating. But out come the gendarmes to line the pit lane, always a sure sign that the finish is not far away. Two minutes to go, and Briggs's cameraman caught Tony Rolt overtaking the Moran Bennett Coupe Cunningham just after the Mulsanne turn. And then it was all over. Tony Rolt brought the winning C-Type over the line, the first car to win Le Mans at an average of over 100 miles an hour for the whole 24 hours. Behind him, the Shark came into third place, and Peter Walker in the second-place C-Type. The tired and overworked Jaguar mechanics sat on the winning car for the victory parade to end a wonderful day for Jaguar. Phil Walters was in the highest place Cunningham and shook hands with everyone. The new Austin Healey 104s finished in line astern. This new model looked good to me. Then Briggs arrived with the 7th place number 1 car, and the team fell upon him as one. And there was room for more on the coupe, which was followed by the 2nd place Jaguar, Peter Walker now riding shotgun. And then the winners, with Duncan Hamilton now at the wheel. And so, after my 3rd Le Mans 24-hour race, to bed. I may have been often to Le Mans, but I'd never been to Snetterton before, and so a trip out to the flatlands of Norfolk seemed a good idea, there to look at club racing as it is in England today. As to be expected, road-going sports cars were in abundance, and the Jaguar XK120, which was introduced at the Earls Court Motor Show nearly 5 years ago now, is the ideal car for the sporting gentleman. The first event was a half-hour reliability trial for touring and sports cars, including the delightful 2.5-litre Alpha of Jimmy Caprara. Snetterton is an old wartime RAF station, and like all aerodrome circuits, it is flat and featureless, and although the sun may be shining, it's always impossible to get out of the wind. The touring section included Stuart Lewis Evans in a Morris Minor and Alan Baker in, would you believe it, a Land Rover. There was a Le Mans start with a sickly-coloured Corvette left behind by the Jaguars. By the end of lap 1, the Corvette's power had allowed it to lead, although this is not a race. Each car had been set an average speed, ranging from 32 miles an hour for a little Austin 7 to 60 miles an hour for the faster cars. This average has to be maintained for the half hour, including a compulsory pit stop, during which a wheel had to be removed, taken around the car, and refitted. Points were deducted for every second the car was either quicker or slower than its set time. Some people, who obviously had time in hand on the track, could afford to be more leisurely in their approach to the pit stop. This being an Aston Martin Owners Club meeting, there was the customary parade of pre-war Feltham-built machinery. Next came the Formula 3 race for 500cc cars. They have become the bedrock of British single-seater racing since 1948 in their introduction. With their 500cc motorcycle engines, most of these cars are built by John Cooper's firm at Surbiton. The race featured the historic Strang, a pioneer machine in this class of racing. Don Parker in the Works Kieft made a super start and was never headed. But behind, a ferocious battle took place for second, with Stuart Lewis Evans, Eric Brandon, Bob Gerrard and Les Leston all involved. Second place finally went to Brandon. In the Formula 2 race, for the United States Air Force trophy, Bob Gerrard made a lightning start in his Cooper Bristol. At the end of lap 1, Gerrard still led from the Connaughts of Tony Rolt and Ken McAlpine. Horace Gould was up to 4th in another Cooper Bristol. After a couple of laps, Rolt passed Gerrard and went on to win by a couple of seconds. Miss Mary Griswold presented the trophy to Rolt. This US Air Force trophy was topped out with a miniature B-52 bomber, presented by Mary's father. The trophy was soon in the safe hands of the Connaught's delighted owner, Rob Walker. There were more congratulations for Rolt from US Air Force General Griswold. The Connaught looked good in Walker's familiar colours, blue with the white noseband. "Yes," remarked Rolt, "that'll look pretty good on Rob's mantelpiece." I was determined in 1954 to put my cine camera to more use than I had the previous year. So with the trees not yet in the full leaf of spring, we motored down to my favourite circuit, Goodwood, near Chichester in Sussex, for the first race of the year, the March members' meeting. The atmosphere at Goodwood is always very relaxed and jolly. It's the nearest we come in these austere days to the pre-war atmosphere of the old Brooklands circuit at Weybridge in Surrey. The changes and work that went on there in wartime mean I'm afraid it will never reopen for racing. My brother used to take film at Brooklands in the 30s, but he wasn't really a motor racing fan, preferring aeroplanes, and so he used to film the old Imperial airliners taking off from Croydon Airport. Kenneth Moore's little 750 Renault won the first race, and then it was the turn of the 1100cc sports cars, with one gentleman taking to the grass, no doubt somewhat intimidated by Gibbs's Riley 5, which finished second, behind Watling Greenwood's RGS Special. In the 1.5-litre scratch race, there are a few MG TDs, underpowered with only 1250cc, their owners no doubt already eagerly awaiting the arrival of the new 1500cc TF. This race was led initially by Peter Gammon's very fast Lotus MG, ahead of John Coombs in his Connaught. Then Gammon's Lotus went on to 3 cylinders, allowing Coombs through to win. The 1.5 to 3.5 litre sports car race featured Cooper Bristols, Jaguar C-Types, XK120s, and all manner of Fraser Nashes, Bristols and Tajeros. Alan Brown's Ferrari look-alike was actually a Cooper Bristol, and he shot into the lead. These 2-litre Bristol engine Coopers are the thing to have in national racing here in Britain, but they never seem to figure much in races abroad. The battle for second place was led by Tony Brooks in his Le Mans replica Fraser Nash, and in third was Michael Head's C-Type Jaguar. pull out when the Cooper's throttle cable let go, and this allowed dental student Tony Brooks to win the race from Head's C-Type. Head had a small lead over the Bristol's London dealer, Tony Crook, this car having engine and chassis from the same source. Peter Gammons, his Lotus now restored to its full setup of 4 MG cylinders, ran away with race 6, another handicap. But as a strong Bentley Drivers Club fan, it was good to see J.H. Bailey thunder past in his vintage 3-litre with a 4.5-litre motor. I spotted Tommy Sopwith in his new 3.5-litre Siddeley Sapphire engine Sphinx. And so to the Easter weekend. On the Bank Holiday Monday, we were at Goodwood again for the traditional international meeting. The Lavant Cup was over 7 laps, and Reg Parnell led from start to finish in the Scuderia Ambrosiana 625 Ferrari. Parnell finished ahead of Roy Salvadori's Maserati and the new Connaught Formula 2 cars for Tony Rolt and Kenneth McAlpine. In the Easter Handicap sports car race, the Acuria Cos C-Types shone in the hands of Jimmy Stewart and Tony Rolt. George Abecassis was down in the middle of the field in the Works HWM, ahead of the likes of Danny Margulis's Delahaye, Sopwith's Sphinx and Cuff Miller's Allard. The 5-lap Chichester Cup race saw Ken Wharton scream to a win in the revised and now lighter V16 BRM, ahead of Salvadori and Parnell on Maserati and Ferrari respectively. During the break, Parnell had time to muse over the Connaught's underpowered Alta engine and compare it to the much more desirable 6-cylinder 2.5-litre motor in Salvadori's Maserati. The Formula 3 race was won by Les Leston in the Works Cooper, ahead of Reg Bicknell's Revis and Don Parker's Kieft. Down in 4th was the number 8 Cooper in the hands of Alan Brown. John Cooper's new 500cc design really looks the part with its low lines and smooth bodywork. The Revis of Reg Bicknell is a startling-looking machine and no mean performer. The final race of the day was a handicap and featured a straight fight between the ERAs of Hamilton and Somervale. The Border Reivers car, number 27 of Jock Somervale, just failed by a 1/5 of a second to catch Hamilton, who'd been given a 3-second advantage by the handicappers. Then came the big race, the 21-lap Glover Trophy. Flockhart and Wharton had swapped cars, and at the end of lap 1, Flockhart led from Wharton in the wonderful 16-cylinder BRMs, ahead of Salvadori and Reg Parnell. Next time around, Wharton led in the Mark 1 BRM with Flockhart second and under pressure from Salvadori. Lap 3, and Salvadori was second, Flockhart falling back with a faulty magneto. Wharton continued leading, driving magnificently in the BRM with Roy Salvadori in the green Maserati right on his tail. Parnell had retired with a faulty gearbox on his Ferrari. And I was delighted to see that this had let Kenneth McAlpine up to third in the Connaught. The battle between Wharton and Salvadori continued, and then with just 3 laps to go, Wharton got the BRM sideways, and Salvadori hit him amidships, spun off and stalled. Wharton, however, was able to rejoin, and he finished ahead of a delighted if fortunate McAlpine, whose Connaught team also took third with Leslie Marr at the wheel. The spluttering BRM of Ron Flockhart finished 4th, so British cars had finished 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th. Just a fortnight later, and we were back again at Goodwood for another members' meeting. Jimmy Stewart, in the Acuria Cos Jaguar C-Type, led the big sports car field, ahead of last year's Le Mans winner, Duncan Hamilton, in his own C-Type. Stewart's teammate was Ninian Sanderson, in another ex-Works Jaguar, with Alan Brown 4th in the familiar Cooper Bristol. After a while, Sanderson began to close on Duncan Hamilton, only to lose it at the chicane and crash out. This let Alan Brown up to third, just ahead of the brilliant young Tony Brooks in his Fraser Nash. In amongst the modern machinery again was the wonderful vintage Bentley, driven so spiritedly by J.H. Bailey. And even more of a rarity, the P2 Alfa Romeo of Nigel Mann with its 2.6-litre engine. A regular racer at Goodwood was Watling Greenwood in his RWG Special, Ford 1098 side valve engine, neat bodywork and MG suspension parts. The British spring weather had changed and it was cold and wet as we motored up to Silverstone a fortnight later for their first big meeting of the year. The International Trophy meeting is the traditional warm-up for the sports cars entered for Le Mans and also for the Formula One cars for the British Grand Prix. The disappointment was that there were no D-types entered. We'll have to wait to see them later. John Wyre's Aston team was there in force, trying out a new V12-engined Lagonda, which owner David Brown says is a Ferrari beater, as well as entering an improved DB3S. Also new that day was the largest engine car that Cooper has yet built, the Mark I Jaguar Cooper for Peter Whitehead. John Cooper looks on, perhaps wishing he'd had time to paint it. Another Jaguar engine device, the HWM, to be driven by George Abecassis into second place, behind Gonzalez's massive 4.9-litre Ferrari. We saw a 500cc Cooper warming up. And my close friend Kenneth McAlpine had entered his Connaught with its Alta engine. Kenneth was a director of and financial backer of the Connaught team. Alan Brown's Cooper Bristol that we'd seen at Goodwood stood wheelless in the paddock. And then at Aston's, with so much to do and so little time in which to do it, it was no wonder John Wyre was looking tired. The V12 Lagonda was nearest the camera as I caught them in conference. The International Trophy race itself was for Formula One cars, and we watched Roy Salvadori warming up the Gilby Engineering Maserati up and down the club straight. It was still raining when the first heat of the big race began, and the Argentinian, the so-called Pampas Bull, Froilan Gonzalez, went straight into the lead. At the end of lap one, he was still there, ahead of Bera's Gordini and Rolt's Connaught, with Sterling Moss in fourth. Gonzalez continued to lead, with Prince Bera now second, and Moss third, having disposed of Bera and Rolt. So Gonzalez took the flag in the first heat and brought the wide-bodied new car back to the Ferrari pit to be readied for the second leg. The burly Argentinian had seen the team change for 1954. His former teammates, Ascari and Villarese, were gone to Lancia, leaving Nino Farina, Mike Hawthorne, and a driver who frankly is more comfortable in sports cars, Umberto Maglioli. The Ferrari mechanics were also uncomfortable, apparently unable to start the Super Squallow for the final. So team orders meant that Frenchman Maurice Trintignant, who had won the second leg, had to hand his car over to Gonzalez for the final, and Maurice himself took over Maglioli's Type 625, leaving Umberto with no car. Moss's transporter was on loan from the Roots Group, for whom he is currently driving international rallies, having now won a Gold Cup for 3 consecutive years on the Coupe des Alpes in his Sunbeam Talbot. Meanwhile, all eyes were on the Ferrari 375 Plus, in which Gonzalez had just won the sports car race. Gonzalez was back to win the Formula One final in the borrowed Type 625, the Ferrari team putting on a show that the British teams could only marvel at. Maybe there is still a long, long way to go before we can start to cheer. The best the home teams could manage was Tony Rolt down in 7th place, behind Gonzalez, Berra and Simon in Gordini's, Mieres' Maserati, and Trintignant and Rosier in more Ferraris. Although we were due to leave on our annual pilgrimage to Le Mans the following Thursday, it was a dry day, so we took the Aston for a run down to Goodwood for a BARC national meeting, arriving just in time to see Jimmy Stewart in the Acuria Cos C-Type leading round the sister car in the hands of Ninian Sanderson. The sounds of Jaguar engines in full cry allowed me to think forwards to Le Mans. We are due to witness the debut of the new D-Type. I learnt today that the Jaguar team has been secretly over to Reims for tyre testing, and in exchange for some money and a 3-car entry in the sports car race at the forthcoming French Grand Prix, had managed to persuade the authorities to close the roads for the team for up to 3 days. The Reims circuit is, of course, like Le Mans, entirely made up of public roads. But I digress. Let's get back to my beloved Goodwood and listen to the racing exhausts along St Mary's Straight, echoing off the South Downs. Ninian Sanderson was about to retake 2nd place from Jerry Dunham's similar C-Type. The 2-litre A6 GCS Maserati belongs to Sid Green of Gilby Engineering and was driven into 4th place with great verve and against much more powerful machinery by Roy Salvador. He'd made a bad start, and in making up for it, he'd set a new lap record. Gosh, it was good to get the Aston motoring again, and to open her up down those long and usually deserted French straights. What a contrast to southern England with its twisty lanes and hedgerows, and where just a half a dozen cars always seems to make a traffic jam. We seem to get to Le Mans in no time. This circuit has been the same 13.5 kilometres long since 1932, so we didn't expect to find any changes when it came to our now traditional tour around the circuit. Over the crest after the Dunlop Bridge and down the hill to the Essex. Down the Mulsanne Straight, we were passed by a Porsche. And Le Mans would not be Le Mans if we didn't stop at the Hippodrome restaurant halfway down the straight for lunch. The collection of cars on show was as mouth-watering as the food. Anything red had to be Italian, and we spotted this delectable and rare little Nardi. The sight of service trucks boosted the adrenaline for the forthcoming race. The Rondel-flanked DB Panhard reminded us of the keen French interest in the small capacity class up to 750cc and in the index of fuel efficiency. British mass production sports cars were represented by Triumph with their TR2. After their reliable if uncompetitive run last year, Austin Healey had stayed away, complaining that the allowing in of prototypes spoiled the spirit of Le Mans. With the start not until 4 o'clock, there was plenty of time to wander the streets of Mamere, where we were staying for the 3rd year in succession, and to prepare our Aston for the rest of the journey. As we arrived at the circuit, the car parks were filling up rapidly, and so was the sky. Rain threatened. The airfield, just across the road behind the main grandstands, was nearly as crammed with light aircraft as the car parks.
In the next episode of A Gentleman's Motor Racing Diary, we return to Le Mans for the race in which Jaguar fail with their D-Type to repeat their 1953 success and are beaten into second by Ferrari. We travel across France to Reims to see the D-Type win its first race and to witness the return of the Silver Arrows. Mercedes back in Formula One for the first time since 1939. We watch the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, and motor racing commences around the Grand National Horse Racing Track at Aintree. Join us for episode 2 of A Gentleman's Motor Racing Diary.